He started the story as a coward hiding inside a barrel. He spent years getting mocked by his own Marine colleagues, and he might be the single most important character for understanding what One Piece is actually about. Today, we are talking about Kobe, and by the end of this video, you might see him completely differently. When people rank One Piece characters, the conversation almost always goes straight to Luffy, Zoro, Shanks, or whichever Yonko is currently trending. Kobe barely gets mentioned. That is a mistake, because Kobe is not just a minor side character who shows up occasionally. He is doing something almost nobody else in this entire story is doing, and it is exactly why he deserves far more credit than he gets. Reason number 1, he represents the path. Luffy never took. Kobe and Luffy meet in the very first arc of the entire series, and that meeting matters more than most fans give it credit for. Kobe starts as a terrified prisoner aboard Alvida's ship, someone who has spent years being controlled through fear with zero ability to stand up for himself. Luffy, in their very first conversation, basically forces Kobe to confront his own cowardice and choose a different life. Here is what makes this genuinely clever from a storytelling perspective. Kobe chooses to join the Marines, not the pirates. He takes the lesson Luffy gives him about courage and applies it to becoming exactly the kind of authority figure the story constantly criticizes. This sets up an entire parallel character arc running alongside Luffy's, except instead of becoming a free-spirited pirate captain, Kobe commits himself to reforming the system from the inside. While Luffy is out breaking the world's rules, Kobe is the one quietly trying to prove that rules and justice do not have to mean cruelty and corruption. That is a genuinely difficult narrative role to pull off, and Oda rarely gets praised for building it this carefully. Reason number 2. His growth is some of the most realistic in the series. One Piece is full of insane power growth. Characters go from struggling against basic enemies to casually fighting Yonko-level threats within a handful of arcs. Kobe's growth works completely differently, and that is exactly what makes it stand out. He does not gain a devil fruit. He does not awaken some hidden bloodline power. He trains under Garp specifically because he has almost no natural talent, and has to build everything through sheer repetition and effort over years, not weeks. By the time of the Reverie arc, Kobe has become a vice admiral, one of the youngest in history, entirely through consistent, grounded effort rather than a sudden power spike. In a story filled with prodigies and monsters of natural talent, Kobe is one of the only major characters whose strength genuinely feels earned through time and discipline rather than destiny. That is rare in this genre, and it deserves far more attention than it gets. Reason number 3. He is one of the only characters brave enough to challenge Marine corruption publicly. This is the moment that should have made Kobe a much bigger fan favorite than he currently is. During the Reverie arc, Kobe stands up in front of the entire Marine hierarchy and publicly questions the morality of Marineford, specifically Akanu's execution of Ace. He does this knowing full well it could end his career, possibly even his life, given who he is speaking in front of. Think about how genuinely rare that is in this story. Most characters who criticize the world government's corruption are pirates or revolutionaries operating completely outside the system. Kobe criticizes it from within, as an active Marine, to the faces of the people holding actual power over him. He gets brutally beaten by Garp, specifically to protect him from worse consequences, which is its own quietly devastating character moment. But the fact remains, Kobe is one of the only characters in this entire story brave enough to challenge the system's morality without ever abandoning his loyalty to the system itself. That is an incredibly difficult position to write convincingly, and Kobe pulls it off. Reason number 4. He sets up a future conflict most fans are not talking about. Here is the part that makes Kobe genuinely important going forward, not just narratively interesting in hindsight. As the story moves toward its final war, the Marines themselves are clearly heading toward an internal split between those loyal to the old guard mentality of Akainu and reformers who believe the institution needs to change from within. Kobe is positioned as one of the clearest representatives of that second group, someone the story has spent 2 decades quietly building as a genuine alternative to Marine corruption. If the ending of One Piece involves any kind of meaningful change to how the world government and Marines function, rather than simply the pirates winning a war, Kobe is one of the few characters actually positioned to represent what that change might look like from inside the system. Most fans are focused entirely on Luffy versus the world government. Almost nobody is talking about Kobe possibly being the answer to what comes after that fight ends. So that is the case for Kobe being the most underrated character in One Piece. A coward who chose courage. A character whose growth was earned through years of effort rather than destiny. Someone brave enough to challenge corruption from inside the very system he serves. And quite possibly, one of the most important pieces still left on the board for how this entire story actually ends.